It started as something ordinary, the kind of small moment you never think will change anything. My brother's friend, Ian, had been around for years, the kind of person who quietly commanded attention without even trying. He was a little older, confident in ways I wasn't, and his laugh had this effortless ease that made everyone like him. Every time he came over, I felt my chest tighten a little, though I told myself it was nothing. He was my brother's friend, someone off limits, part of that circle I was supposed to admire from a distance. That evening, he showed up while my brother was away, dropping by just to say hello. We talked for a while, the conversation easy, his tone friendly, but somehow more personal than usual. When he said, "You should come over sometime. I could use some help with my project," I said yes before thinking. It was meant to be casual, but even the invitation left a quiet tremor in my chest. Later that night, I walked to his apartment. The city was settling down, streetlights flickering against a still sky. His building was quiet, the air faintly scented with rain that hadn't fallen yet. He opened the door with a small smile that felt almost too gentle. Inside, the place was warm and calm. Music played softly from his phone, a tune I couldn't name, but felt like something meant for the background of long, honest conversations that we sat together, first talking about my brother, about work, about how fast time moved. It should have felt normal, but it didn't. There was something different in the way he looked at me, in the pauses between our words. I caught myself watching the shape of his hands as he poured tea, the way the light from the lamp drew faint gold lines along his jaw. I tried to steady my breathing, that he asked me questions I wasn't used to hearing, what I wanted to do with my life, what made me happy, what I was afraid of. No one asked things like that. I found myself answering too honestly, telling him things I hadn't said out loud before. Every answer seemed to make the space between us smaller. At T1 point, I reached for my cup, and our fingers brushed. It was nothing, a brief mistake, but I pulled back as if burned. He smiled, not teasingly, but softly, as though he understood what that small contact meant. I felt a rush of confusion, warmth, fear, something I couldn't name. I looked away, pretending to check my phone, to say something meaningless, but the words tangled in my throat. The hours stretched. Outside, the world had gone completely dark. The light in the room felt almost golden, like time had slowed down just for us. He told me about his family, his childhood, how he often felt out of place even in familiar rooms. The honesty in his voice made something in me unclench. I realized how much I had wanted someone to see me, to notice me in that quiet way. When the silence finally settled, it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt heavy but calm, as though both of us were listening to something we couldn't quite say. He looked at me for a long time, eyes steady, not searching but recognizing. I didn't know what he saw in that look, only that it made my heart beat faster. "You don't have to hide who you are with me," he said. His voice was low, careful, as if he was afraid the words might break if spoken too loudly that I didn't answer right away. My throat felt tight. I stared at the cup between my hands, steam fading into the air. There were 1,000 things I wanted to say, but all I managed was a small nod. He smiled again, not pressing for more, and the quiet stretched until it became the only language left between us. That night, when I finally stepped outside, the street was almost empty. I could still feel the warmth of his apartment on my skin, the echo of his words in my chest. I walked home with the sound of that sentence looping in my head, unsure whether it had freed me or trapped me, only certain that nothing would ever feel quite the same again. The rain began not long after I arrived again, a thin, steady whisper against the windows that made the night feel smaller. The world outside blurred into moving shadows, while inside his apartment, everything seemed sharper. The faint scent of coffee, the ticking of the clock, the quiet between us. We sat close, but not too close, the kind of distance that hums with unspoken tension. Every sound, every glance carried weight, like we were both waiting for something neither of us could name. That he asked if I was cold and offered a blanket. I said I was fine, but he placed it over my shoulders anyway, his fingers brushing my neck for a second too long. That single touch sent a quiet shiver down my spine. I could feel my heart racing, though nothing had happened. It was the silence that did it, the kind that holds its breath, Ian looked out the window and said softly, I think about that night sometimes. He didn't have to say which one. I did too. I told him I hadn't stopped thinking about it, though I wasn't sure why. He smiled in that small, almost shy way I'd only seen once before. The room felt warmer, smaller, and suddenly full of meaning. I don't want to make things complicated, he said. You already have, I whispered before I could stop myself. The words hung there, fragile and impossible to take back, that he turned toward me, his eyes calm but uncertain. You know, your brother means a lot to me, he said quietly. You do too, but this, whatever this is, it's dangerous. I wanted to say I understood, but I didn't. I didn't understand why my chest hurt when he spoke, or why my hands trembled. I just knew that something inside me had already crossed a line, and there was no way back to before. The rain grew heavier, tapping harder against the glass. It was like the world outside had faded, leaving only the room, the sound, and the weight of our breathing. He moved a little closer, not touching me, but near enough that I could feel his warmth. My throat tightened. I've noticed how you look at me, he said softly, almost like a confession. At first, I tried to ignore it. I thought it was just curiosity. But then, he trailed off, as if the rest of the sentence was too dangerous to finish that I didn't speak. My eyes burned, my heart ached, and I felt the kind of fear that comes when you realize you've already gone too far. Finally, I said, I don't want to pretend anymore. The words trembled as they left me. He didn't move for a moment. Then he exhaled slowly, like someone surrendering after a long fight. The distance between us disappeared, but not in a way that could be described. It was quiet, only two people sitting in the soft light, the world spinning differently for a while. There were no grand gestures, no declarations. Just a moment that felt suspended between truth and regret. When his hand found mine, it wasn't bold. It was careful, unsure, like asking for permission to exist. I didn't pull away. The clock ticked on. Outside, thunder rolled distantly, soft and fading. Inside, the air changed. I could feel the warmth of his skin, the tremor of something real but forbidden. I wanted it to stop and continue all at once. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. Sometimes the things that feel right don't belong to us. I looked at him, then really looked and saw the conflict written across his face. He wasn't fearless like I had always thought. He was just as afraid as I was. The realization hurt and comforted me at the same time. We sat in silence again, both staring at the floor, as if the truth might disappear if we stayed quiet long enough. The room was filled with everything we didn't say. The rain began to slow, and for a while, there was only the sound of our hearts beating out of sync. I wanted to speak, to tell him that I didn't regret anything, that I couldn't. But I didn't. I just sat there, memorizing the dim light on his face, knowing that whatever this was, it could never survive the morning.
The rain had started just as I left home that evening. It wasn't heavy, just enough to blur the world outside my window as I sat in the car, watching the drops gather and slide away. My father's friend, Mr. Cameron, had called earlier, asking if I could stop by his house to help him organize some old files. His tone had been warm, almost fatherly, yet there was something about the invitation that lingered in my mind long after the call ended. My father trusted Cameron more than most people. They had been close since college, and growing up, I often saw him around our house. He'd bring gifts on birthdays, ask about school, and tell stories about his travels that always left me wide-eyed. As I got older, those stories changed, less about places, more about people, loss, and quiet solitude. Cameron lived alone after his divorce. He never remarried, and though he smiled easily, there was always something restrained behind his eyes, like a secret he didn't want to share. When I reached his house that night, the gate was slightly open. A single light glowed through the living room window, casting soft golden lines across the wet pavement. I hesitated before stepping inside. The smell of old books and freshly brewed coffee greeted me, familiar and comforting. Cameron appeared from the hallway, his sleeves rolled up, a faint smile curving his lips. "You came," he said. "I wasn't sure you'd remember." "I said I would," I replied, trying to sound casual. "You needed help with something, right?" He nodded and gestured toward the study. "Just some old papers. My back's not what it used to be." I followed him down the corridor. The air felt different here, quieter, thicker somehow. The walls were lined with framed photographs of his younger days, college events, hiking trips, faces frozen in time. He noticed me looking. "Strange how fast it all passes," he said softly. "You blink, and suddenly you're the only one left in the pictures." I smiled politely, unsure what to say. There was a calm melancholy in his voice that I had never noticed before. Inside the study, the smell of paper and dust hung in the air. Stacks of folders lay on the desk, half open, their contents spilling onto the floor. I began sorting through them as he talked about my father, about work, about how different things were when they were our age. He spoke slowly, thoughtfully, as if measuring every word. After a while, he stopped speaking and just watched me. I felt it before I looked up, the weight of his gaze. When I finally met his eyes, there was something unreadable there. Not discomfort exactly, but intensity, quiet and deliberate. I looked away first. "You've grown up a lot," he said after a pause. "Your father would be proud." The compliment caught me off guard. I guess so." He smiled faintly. "You remind me of him. The same way of thinking before speaking. The same silence when you're uncertain." I busied myself with another pile of papers to hide the flush on my face. The clock on the wall ticked louder than before. The rain had stopped outside, but the quiet it left behind felt heavier. After an hour or so, the work was done. Cameron poured 2 cups of tea and handed me one. "You've done enough. Sit for a while," he said. We sat across from each other, the dim light from a nearby lamp softening the lines of his face. The conversation drifted from the trivial to the personal. He asked about my plans, my struggles, the kind of questions that reached deeper than small talk. His tone wasn't probing, just patient, almost protective. When I mentioned feeling unsure about where I was heading in life, he leaned forward slightly. "It's all right to be uncertain," he said. "Sometimes what we think is confusion is just the beginning of understanding ourselves." Something about the way he said it lingered, echoing long after the words had faded. I realized how different this moment felt, how strangely intimate it was, sitting here with him, sharing silence that didn't demand to be filled. He stood and glanced toward the hallway. "Come," he said quietly. "There's something I want to show you. It's in the other room." I followed him, unsure why my heart had started beating faster. The corridor was darker now, the lights dimmed, shadows stretching long across the floor. He walked ahead, his footsteps slow and deliberate. As he reached for the door at the end of the hall, I hesitated for a breath. There was no reason to fear, and yet something in me stirred, a strange blend of curiosity and unease. Then he pushed the door open, and the darkness inside seemed to wait for us both. The door creaked as Mr. Cameron pushed it open. The room beyond was dim, its single lamp casting a cone of yellow light over a cluttered desk. Papers were spread across it, photographs, notebooks, and something half-finished that looked like a letter. He gestured for me to step inside. "I come here when I need to think," he said quietly. "Some rooms keep memories better than people do." I stood by the doorway, unsure whether to move closer. The air felt dense, thick with the smell of paper and dust. Cameron leaned against the desk, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Only the faint hum of the ceiling fan filled the silence. Then he said, "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life? Like you've done everything right, and still something feels missing?" His words hung in the air, honest and heavy. I hesitated before answering. "Sometimes. I think everyone does." He nodded slowly. "When I was your age, I used to think I had it all figured out. Now I'm not sure I ever really lived at all." The conversation drifted between confession and reflection. He spoke about loneliness, not as a complaint, but as a fact of existence. About how time blurs intentions, how trust becomes rare, how affection can turn into silence. I listened, trying to understand the man my father called his best friend. There was a vulnerability in him I hadn't seen before. His words didn't sound rehearsed, they trembled with something real. It made me uncomfortable, not because of what he said, but because I saw in him a reflection of the questions I was afraid to ask myself. He reached for one of the photographs on the desk, a younger version of him and my father, arms around each other, smiling. "Your father and I thought the world would always stay this bright," he murmured. "But people drift. You learn to live with shadows." The silence that followed pressed against the room like a heartbeat. I found myself saying, "You're not as alone as you think. You still have him. You have me." He looked up sharply, as if my words startled him. "Do I?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Something in his tone, fragile, searching, made me take a step back. I realized then how far the evening had carried us from where it began. What started as a simple visit had become something else, something neither of us had intended. The warmth between us had turned uncertain, blurred by unspoken emotion. I should probably go, I said finally. It's getting late. Cameron looked at me for a long moment before nodding. You're right, he said softly. Some nights are better ended before they turn into memories. As I turned to leave, he added, you remind me that honesty still exists. Don't lose that, no matter what life gives you. The words stopped me in the doorway. I looked back at him, and for the first time, he seemed small, like a man standing in the ruins of his own choices. Outside, the night had deepened. The rain had started again, gentler this time, tapping against the pavement. I walked toward the gate, each step pulling me further from the house but not from the thoughts it left behind. I in the car, I sat for a while before starting the engine. The streetlights shimmered through the rain, blurring into streaks of gold. My reflection stared back from the window, older, maybe, or simply more aware. I didn't know how to name what had happened between us. It wasn't friendship anymore, and it wasn't something I could explain. It was a collision of loneliness, kindness, and misunderstanding. As the car pulled away, I caught one last glimpse of the house in the rearview mirror. A single light still burned in that dark room, flickering like a heartbeat that refused to die. Whatever had passed there tonight would not be spoken of again. But it would linger quietly, like the rain, reminding me how fragile the line between comfort and danger could be.